While Americans are paying more for Japanese cars, is Japan preparing a financial blow that could shake the U.S. economy? U.S.-Japan auto trade war. The U.S. has continuously raised tariffs on automobile parts imported from Japan, particularly in the electric vehicle industry. A 25% tariff on auto parts has driven up the prices of Toyota, Honda, and Nissan cars in the U.S., causing these models to lose their major competitive edge advantage in the market. According to the latest report from the Japan Automobile Manufacturers Association, Japanese car sales in the U.S. have dropped by about 7% in the first quarter of 2025. Meanwhile, U.S. automakers such as Ford and General Motors are attracting more customers due to government protection policies. This price increase not only reduces consumers' purchasing power but also harms Japanese automakers as profits sharply decline and production costs rise. Japan responds beyond words. However, Japan is not just responding with tough rhetoric. In fact, it has started selling off a large portion of the U.S. Treasury bonds it holds. Japan is currently the second largest creditor to the U.S., with over $1.1 trillion in bonds. In February 2025, Japan sold $30 billion worth of U.S. bonds, and this decision weakened the U.S. dollar and increased interest rates in the U.S., creating significant financial pressure. This is a high-risk financial strategy, as Japan is using its financial influence to directly affect the U.S. economy. Additionally, Japan is shifting its car production lines out of the U.S., with a significant portion of manufacturing moving to Mexico and Southeast Asia. This helps Japan minimize the impact of tariffs while still being able to supply products to the U.S. market without facing high tax rates. Japanese automakers like Toyota and Honda are heavily investing in manufacturing plants in Mexico and Southeast Asia, where labor costs are lower and unaffected by the protectionist tax policies from the U.S. This not only affects the U.S., but also makes international investors more cautious about purchasing U.S. bonds, especially as Japan is reducing its investment in this market. Future strategies. If the U.S. continues to make tougher decisions, Japan may escalate its retaliation measures. One possibility is to limit the export of core technologies, particularly solid-state batteries, which are leading the electric vehicle industry. Japan, with automakers like Toyota and Honda, is at the forefront of this technology. If the U.S. imposes tariffs on Japanese electric vehicle technologies, Japan might halt the export of solid-state batteries, which would significantly hinder the development of electric vehicles in the U.S., especially at a time when the U.S. is trying to boost electric vehicle production. Additionally, Japan could increase retaliatory tariffs on imported U.S. goods, directly impacting consumer products, machinery, electronic components, and even food. Cooperation with the EU and market diversification. While continuing to strengthen its cooperation with the U.S., Japan is actively expanding its trade relations with the European Union, EU. This will help Japan reduce its dependence on the U.S. market while creating additional opportunities for its automotive industry to grow in other markets. The EU has signed trade agreements with Japan, helping to expand the market and mitigate the risks from the possibility of further U.S. tariff hikes. At the same time, Japan is increasing electric vehicle production in these markets to maintain its competitive edge. The EU is not only an important market for Japanese cars, but also a strategic partner in providing new electric vehicle technologies, ensuring that Japan is not left behind in the global trend. Will Japan be able to force the U.S. to change its tax policies, or will the U.S. continue to take a hard stance, causing widespread financial impacts? Stay with us to find out more in the next video. The European Union has taken strong action with a counterattack decision worth up to $27 billion USD targeting U.S. goods. Is this a strategic move to help the EU maintain its economic strength, or a dangerous blow to the global economy? Trump's tariff move. In 2018, President Trump launched a strong tariff campaign, imposing a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum imports into the U.S. The main goal was to reduce the trade deficit and protect domestic industries. However, this move not only affected countries like China and Canada, but also strained the economic relationship between the U.S. and the European Union. The EU, with its strength in steel and metal exports, began to feel significant pressure from these decisions. Trump argued that this was a strategy to protect America first, but experts believe it was an interference with the principles of free trade. And when major trading partners are affected, A response was inevitable. The EU administration started calculating and preparing for the next steps. EU's $27 billion retaliation. With the US imposing tariffs on products like steel, aluminum, and agricultural goods, the EU could not stand by. Recently, the European Union announced a $27 billion retaliation package. These are not random figures, but the result of thorough research and planning by the European Commission. In this retaliation package, the EU targets iconic American products like motorcycles, wine, agricultural goods, and even technology products. These high-value items have a significant impact on U.S. businesses. This strategy is not only economic, but also a strong political message. We are not vulnerable. This means that if the U.S. does not change its policies, the EU will continue to raise tariffs on more American products. Once these measures are implemented, both economies will face unpredictable consequences, from rising prices to disruptions in global supply chains. Washington's reaction. So how will the U.S. respond to this move by the EU? The Washington administration quickly stated that the EU's tariff package would harm both sides. Some U.S. officials believe this decision could accelerate inflation and harm domestic consumers and businesses. A common viewpoint from the U.S. side is that if the EU carries out this plan, the U.S. market will be severely impacted, particularly in the agricultural and manufacturing sectors. However, these assessments were not enough to diminish the EU's resolve. As they stated, "We will not back down." The European Union emphasized that this step is necessary to promote economic independence and protect long-term interests. European leaders believe that despite facing challenges, the firm implementation of this plan will strengthen the EU's global position, EU unity, and internal concerns. Despite concerns from member countries, such as Germany and France, about the impact of the trade war on their economies, the European Union has demonstrated unity in responding to the U.S. decision. Germany, one of the largest exporters to the U.S., particularly in the automotive sector, fears it will be directly affected if U.S. tariffs continue to be imposed. However, the EU cannot allow these concerns to weaken the unity of the bloc. EU leaders have emphasized that to have strength in negotiations, they must remain united and not make concessions. All member countries understand that if the EU does not stand together, each nation will become divided and weaker. Therefore, this unity is a crucial factor in the strategy to counter the US. Certainly, the EU's decision has marked an important milestone in global trade relations. Is this a bold move by the EU to safeguard its interests? Or will it turn into a painful blow for both economies? Stay tuned with us in the video to learn more. Last February, 500,000 Canadians stopped crossing the US border. Tourism numbers have plummeted, hitting the lowest point since the 2022 pandemic. And it doesn't stop there. American goods are now facing a massive boycott in Canada. So, what's really happening? And more importantly, is this the sign of a major shift? This story might just surprise you. Donald Trump and Canadian politics. What's happening? Beyond trade and military tensions, a political firestorm is now unfolding. In a recent statement, Donald Trump hinted that he prefers working with Canada's current government over conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. And just like that, the debate in Canada exploded. Key questions emerge. Why now? Why did Trump make such a public statement about Canadian politics? Could this affect Canada's upcoming election? And more importantly, what does this mean for U.S.-Canada relations? This is one of the rare times a former U.S. president has openly weighed in on Canada's internal politics. And it signals something big. U.S.-Canada relations are entering a new phase. One that is anything but simple. Are Canadians abandoning America? For years, Canada has been one of the most critical markets for the U.S. Millions of Canadians cross the border for shopping, tourism, and business, especially in places like New York, Michigan, and Washington. But now, that trend is reversing. According to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, in February 2024, 2.2 million Canadian travelers entered the U.S. That's 500,000 fewer than the same period last year. And it's the lowest number since April 2022. And it's not just about fewer tourists. Canadians are also spending less on American products. Data from the Business Development Bank of Canada reveals sales of American goods in Canada have dropped by 6%. Meanwhile, demand for Canadian-made products is surging. So why are Canadians changing their spending and travel habits? The answer may be tied to a crucial decision made by the U.S. on February 1st. U.S. imposes new tariffs. How is Canada responding? On February 1st, the U.S. government announced new tariffs on Canadian imports, set to take effect on April 2nd. The consequences? Canadian goods will become more expensive in the U.S., making them less competitive. Industries like agriculture and manufacturing will take a direct hit. The Canadian government wasted no time in responding. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly made it clear, despite the upcoming U.S. election, Canada will protect its economy and jobs. But the most significant reaction, it came from the Canadian people. They cut back on spending at U.S. stores. Canadian businesses reported a sharp increase in domestic sales. And this may be just the beginning of a much bigger shift. Is Canada reducing its dependence on the U.S.? It's not just about trade. Canada is also moving toward military independence from the U.S. right now. The Canadian government is in talks with the European Union, searching for alternatives to U.S. defense contracts. And here's a big move. Canada is considering dropping its F-35 fighter jet deal with the U.S. in favor of Sweden's Gripen, made by Saab. Why the shift? U.S. trade policies are unpredictable, making reliance on American defense a risk. Canada-EU ties are strengthening, creating new strategic opportunities. Canada wants more control over its own defense industry. If this trend continues, Canada's military relationship with the U.S. could shift significantly. And that's not the only issue making headlines. Key takeaways. Donald Trump's remarks on Canadian politics could shift diplomatic relations between the two nations. 500,000 fewer Canadians are crossing into the U.S. Tourism has plummeted. Sales of American goods in Canada have dropped 6%, while Canadian-made products are thriving. The U.S. imposed new tariffs on Canadian goods, set to take effect April 2nd. Canada is exploring new defense partnerships, potentially ditching U.S. fighter jets for Sweden's Gripen. But the biggest question remains, is this the beginning of a new era between the U.S. and Canada? Stay tuned. There's much more to uncover. Could the Supreme Court Chief Justice's decision to reject the call for impeachment from the sitting president be a sign of a major shift in how disputes are handled within the U.S. government? From criticism to strong rebuttal, Chief Justice John Roberts did not hesitate to reject the strong criticism from President Trump regarding a judge in the case of deporting Venezuelan gang members. In social media posts, Trump called the judge a troublemaker and called for impeachment due to the ruling that halted deportation flights without clear legal procedures. Not only did Chief Justice Roberts reject the call for impeachment, but he also emphasized that impeachment is not the appropriate method for resolving disagreements with court decisions. The appellate process is the legal tool for addressing dissent. This is a strong affirmation of the judiciary's authority and a reminder that the judicial system must be protected. In doing so, Roberts reinforced the critical role of the judiciary in maintaining the balance of power. His statement serves as a clear message that the rule of law must prevail over personal or political conflicts. The realities and importance of upholding legal principles. Although the calls for impeachment from Trump and Elon Musk have stirred public opinion, in reality, impeachment of a judge is nearly impossible. To impeach a judge, at least 23 senators must agree, a requirement that is currently unachievable, as the parties in the Senate remain firmly entrenched in their positions. This highlights the complex political dynamics at play, where bipartisan support for such a move is virtually non-existent. Moreover, it underscores the resilience of the judicial system, which continues to operate independently despite external pressures. In fact, this is part of a strategy to counteract unfavorable rulings against the previous administration's policies. However, the difficulty in achieving impeachment highlights the deep divide in legal and power perspectives in the U.S. This raises a crucial question. Can legal decisions be influenced by pressure from powerful individuals? And can the judicial system maintain its independence in the increasingly complex political landscape? Protecting human rights in the legal system. Congressman Jamie Raskin pointed out a critical point. The rights of those facing deportation cannot be overlooked without a full legal process. Protecting human rights, even when the individuals are accused of being gang members, must be prioritized. Without strict legal procedures, mistakes can happen, leading to the deportation of innocent people without the opportunity to defend their rights. This is not only a legal issue, but also an ethical one. A fair legal system cannot rely solely on accuses, but must be based on evidence and legal processes to ensure justice is served. Why are judges not easily impeached? Impeaching a judge is not a simple process. Under U.S. law, a federal judge can only be impeached if they commit serious legal violations. This requires the agreement of at least 23 senators, a number that is very difficult to achieve, given the current political climate. In this case, the judges acted within their powers and based their decisions on clear legal principles. Therefore, despite calls for impeachment from prominent individuals, the process faces many obstacles. This highlights the importance of protecting the independence of the judiciary, preventing legal decisions from being influenced by external factors. It also underscores the necessity for all legal actions to adhere to legal procedures, ensuring justice for all involved. Despite the controversies and calls for change from powerful individuals, the U.S. legal system remains steadfast in its principles. Justice must be executed through lawful and fair processes, free from interference, even from the president or those with great power in society. Could this be a sign of a shift in how disputes are handled within the U.S. political landscape? Stay tuned to find out more. As the U.S. economy falters, Canada not only remains resilient, but also strikes back with force. From boycotting American goods and canceling travel to launching strategic countermeasures, Canada has proven that it won't be easily subdued. This is an uneven confrontation, and this time, Trump is the one losing control. But will he retreat or push the U.S. further into an inescapable economic crisis? Trump once claimed that tariffs would strengthen the U.S. economy, but in reality, his erratic policies have only plunged the country deeper into crisis. U.S. GDP is plummeting. The Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta projects a 2.8% decline in U.S. GDP, marking one of the steepest drops since the 2008 financial crisis. Meanwhile, Canada's economy remains stable, growing at 3.2% thanks to its flexible trade policies. Consumer confidence in the U.S. has hit a decade low, while Canada's has risen by 4.7%, reflecting a stark contrast in market sentiment between the two countries. Inflation continues to rise, with food prices in the U.S. increasing by 5.3% compared to just 2.1% in Canada, illustrating how Trump's tariff policies are making life increasingly difficult for Americans. The U.S. stock market is in turmoil, with the Dow Jones dropping 7% in just 2 weeks, while Canada's Toronto Stock Exchange, TSX, rose 2.5%, demonstrating investors' confidence in a more stable economy. Canada wasted no time in striking back, delivering a powerful blow to the U.S. economy. Boycott of American goods spreads. Provinces such as Ontario and Quebec removed American liquor from store shelves, causing sales of brands like Jack Daniel's and Kentucky Bourbon to plummet by over 30% within a month, costing U.S. producers millions. U.S. tourism takes a major hit. 65% of Canadians canceled their trips to the U.S., leading to over $5 billion in losses for the American tourism and hospitality industry. Hotels, restaurants, and attractions in border states like New York, Michigan, and Washington are facing severe revenue declines. Canada reduces dependence on the U.S. Exports from the U.S. to Canada dropped by 15%, while Canada is expanding trade with alternative partners. The U.S. auto industry struggles. Canada raised import tariffs on American cars by 15%, increasing prices and slashing sales. This particularly impacts Michigan and Ohio, where thousands of jobs depend on the auto industry. Beyond economic retaliation, Canadian leaders are openly condemning Trump's policies on international platforms. Chrystia Freeland: "These are the dumbest tariffs in history. The U.S. is hurting itself more than it is hurting Canada." Prime Minister Justin Trudeau: "We will not back down." Canada will maintain its retaliatory measures until the U.S. removes these unjustified tariffs. Mark Carney, a leading candidate for the Liberal Party leadership. Canada's economy will outpace the U.S. if Trump's administration continues its failed policies. Canadian media and business leaders are criticizing Trump, calling this a crisis of his own making, while even some of America's allies are questioning Washington's stability. With every tariff Trump imposes, Canada not only retaliates but ensures the U.S. economy suffers greater losses. The U.S. is losing its trade advantage, while Canada expands its economic partnerships, reducing reliance on the American market. Chaos within Trump's administration continues as businesses and officials criticize his inconsistent trade policies. U.S. states are feeling the impact, particularly industrial hubs like Michigan, Ohio, and Texas, which depend heavily on exports to Canada. Trump's approval rating continues to drop, reaching 39%, the lowest since his re-election campaign began. The U.S.-Canada trade war is escalating rapidly. Do you think Trump will find a way out of this crisis?